Hello and welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, your daily current affairs partner for smart, focused UPSC preparation. It's June 17, 2025, and today's edition brings you two key analysis topics that connect global diplomacy and regional strategy. Firstly, we begin with the highlights from the G7 Summit 2025, understanding its outcome and India's positioning on the global stage. Next, we dive into India's balancing act in the Bay of Bengal, a strategic look at the maritime diplomacy and regional influence. Finally, our simplified section is packed with prelims 2026 relevant updates covering unemployment data, FDI insights, the Bonn Convention on climate change, FATF mechanism, and key disaster management platforms. So let's begin. Hi guys, welcome back again to another interesting episode of The Analyst, where in the very beginning we will be starting with the most important international institution in the news right now, that is the G7. And the G7 summit is going to be undertaken in Canada in this year 2025. In the previous year it was in Italy. Now here, this particular summit is of great importance because of the recent ongoing events, and obviously from the perspective of mains examination from GS2, we have to understand the various international institutions, agencies, their mandate, and obviously their structure and fora and the various other implications which are going to do in this article. So let us start. We'll be starting with the very basics, firstly with the overview of the G7. I know all of you must have come across the G7 when you read the newspaper on a regular basis. So this is just to sort out some of those basics things before we move on to the advanced ones. Firstly, when I talk about the G7, it is actually an informal meeting of some advanced countries. Now these are Canada, Germany, Italy, the US, France, the UK, and Japan. Actually, Russia was also a part of the G7 when it was actually called the G8. But after Russia had an invasion of the Crimea province of the Ukraine, so it was actually debarred from the G8 group, and later on it became the G7. And when we talk about it being an informal grouping of 7 countries, we actually mean that these are the advanced economies who contribute to 10% of the world population, but 31% of the global GDP, accounting for almost 20 to 21% of the global carbon emissions. So we can actually understand the importance of these countries. And when we talk about how this particular G7 evolved over a period of time, we have to look into the origins firstly, which is extremely crucial for your mains and also your prelims examination, because lately we have seen that UPSC is kind of going beyond those headquarters or say various other initiatives and going to the background and going to the various themes of the various international institutions. So when I talk about the G7, in 1975 it was actually conceptualized as an informal grouping of some 6 countries, where later Canada joined in 1976. Then it became the G7. Initially it was actually a grouping of the advanced economies which were focused on curtailing their own problems of inflation, the global oil shocks, or even the infamous 1970s global recession. And generally over a period of time we have seen how, with the subsequent strengthening of the United States and the ushering of the unipolar world, where after the collapse of the USSR, the United States actually gained prominence internationally. It tried to use the various international organizations such as the G7, such as the United Nations, and the various other important organizations. And here the US tried to extend its liberalization, globalization, and obviously the various FDI flows from the US or the Western countries to the developing nations. And that is why the G7 became a very important grouping for this matter. Now, from 2010 onwards, when we have the rise of China, when we have the issues of climate change, when we have the recent outbreak of the COVID pandemic in 2020, 21, 22, the G7 was also very instrumental in actually addressing some of these issues. And lately, we have the various international debates on data privacy, the rise of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and obviously the militarization and the global conflicts which are going on right now. The G7 is actually a very important term in the policy circles internationally. Now, when we talk about some of the nitty bits of the working of the G7, we have to understand that it has a rotating presidency. That means each year one member will be setting the agenda. After that, we have to also appreciate the fact that we do not have any formal admission criteria in 1970s. Actually, the period of 1970s, the decades back then. So the advanced economies, the top advanced economies actually formed a grouping based on the 1970s era. But we have to understand from 1990s, 2000s, 2010s to recently, we have right now the emerging nations of China, of India, and obviously the other eminent countries also which were advanced earlier are still advanced right now, such as the US, Germany, and so on. So don't you think that over a period of time, when this G7 grouping was actually conceptualized of consisting economies and consisting advanced societies, we have to also factor how over a period of time the G7 should have also changed. So this is actually one of the main criticism that G7 faces, because still now it is actually an elite club when it comes to international organizations. Now, when I talk about how it works in the real life, it is firstly starts with the Sherpa track. Now, by Sherpa, recently you must have also come across the news that the 1980 batch IAS officer Amitabh Kant, who have had experiences in the Niti Aayog after a long service in the IAS, then he actually went on to become the G20 Sherpa of India. So actually what the Sherpas does for their countries is actually they try to prepare the agenda for the meetings of the G7, and obviously the Sherpas are also present in the G20 framework, where they also perform the same thing. They actually are supported by the political directors, the foreign affairs ministers, and the various other important people and dignitaries who help the Sherpas to prepare the agenda, what will be going to discuss at the G7, what are the issues at the table, what are the national interests of those particular countries. After that, the G7 Sherpas actually prepare this kind of agenda. After that, we have the ministerial and expert meetings where, these particular ministers and obviously the various experts involved, they meet year round to draft policies. And at the end of this entire meeting, when the summit actually takes place, as the summit is taking place right now, right, the heads of the state or the various government comes to those participating country and they actually sign some joint outcomes or declaration, and within that this was traditionally actually a joint communique or joint statement which was released by the G7 countries earlier. But as of now, this particular single joint statement is right now replaced by various sectoral statements actually passed by those G7 countries. So this is exactly what goes on under G7 summit. And when we talk about the last year's summit which took place in Italy, we have had so many declarations. Now, before I move on, how this particular G7 summit is extremely important for the entire world and also for India, I need to highlight how India is also a very important and crucial component of G7. India is not the member of G7, but every year India gets the invitation to actually participate in the summit, because we have to understand India's key interest in recent times surround our trade relations with the G7 countries. Obviously, when we talk about the G7, we are mainly talking about the Western economies, which is actually a large source of market. Apart from that, India is also trying to right now tap in to various investment sectors in the critical minerals, semiconductor industry, and obviously electronic manufacturing components and various other aspects related to trade. Apart from that, we are also trying to invest in AI via procurement of GPUs from prominent companies from the US. So all of these trickle down to one component, that is trade, which is of high importance for India, and that is why India has participated uniformly across the past G7 summits. After that, India is also looking to transition from a fossil fuel based economy to an increasingly green economy over a period of time, which would require a lot of investments, a lot of funds, a lot of technology that should be coming from the Western countries, and that is why we are also participating here. Next, obviously we cannot ignore security as of now. Security is of highest agenda, particularly not only to starve against the cyber security threats or the various other threats. We have China in the region. We have this particular country in the Indo-Pacific region, which is extremely aggressive towards our ambitions in this particular aspect. And finally, the artificial intelligence, the technological aspects which we are collaborating with the UK, with the US, the Germany, France, and so on. We are trying to have ethical AI principles, space quantum computing technologies, and so on. So this is why we have to keep this in mind. Now, when we talk about the hiccups which we have pertaining to the Indian participation in the G7 summit, so this is from the Western angle we have to think firstly about Russia. I mean, India and Russia have been close friends for so many decades, but the Western countries have, various instances where they have implied sanctions, where they have been very strict with the Russian country as a whole. And India is trying to maintain this tight balance, which sometimes is not welcomed by the Western countries. And even at times, we have seen so many times where our External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, have had to combat various journalists on the public forum on this particular matter too. Now, after this, obviously, we have to understand that this particular summit is taking place in the Canada. Now here, we know the background from 2023 to 2024 when the US-Canada relations are at right now at historical lows. Well, right now, during Justin Trudeau's tenure as the Prime Minister of Canada, the relations plummeted. Right now, when he is removed from the office and the new Canadian Prime Minister is at the helm, so we now expect that maybe those ties can improve because of the strained Sikh separatism row that we have seen over the last 1 to 2 years, and that is why we have to keep this hiccup in mind too. And finally, we are competing with China, and G7 countries, mainly some of the European countries, are also trying to de-risk or kind of having some normalization relations with China in recent times because they do not want to risk their trade relations. And obviously, when we talk about them, we are talking about the European countries because the European markets are reliant upon the Chinese imports. And if there is some risk factors between this particular market, there can be cases of high amount of inflation, supply chain crisis, and so on. So that is why we have to keep this thing in mind. Now we have to keep these 5 things to watch out in this fractured G7 summit as of now. Why fractured? Because the recent world is extremely fractured along political lines, along military lines, along economic interests, and obviously we have this overarching threat of the nuclear crisis all of the time. So that is why, according to various experts, it is said that the Western dominance in international relations is going down. And this is a concern for the G7 community too. Now, when we talk about these 5 things, I have to firstly start with the US. Now, when we talk about the US, obviously Mr. Trump comes to my mind, who is no more. Now guys, he is alive, but he is no more present at the G7 summit as of I am speaking right now, because on his way out, he slammed the French President Macron due to some reasons, and he left the summit. But despite that, we have to understand the US is still present at the summit. It can still potentially influence the outcomes. But when we talk about the G7 summit taking place right now, we have to keep in mind the trade wars 2.0 that Mr. Trump has actually announced, and this is significant 2.0. Why? Because this kind of tariffs are also against the European nations, also among the participating G7 nations, right? Next, also in 2018, the last time Mr. Trump was the president of the US, he actually abused the G7 members and the leaders and stormed out of the meeting. So we can actually get some idea of his, operations, particularly in the diplomatic field, pertaining to US interests. Obviously, again, the US president recently also termed Canada as a 51st US state. There are 50 states in the USA. But this kind of statements totally go against the spirit of the G7 and obviously the spirit of, good relations between US and Canada. And that is actually something that the Canadian Prime Minister is also very aware of. And at the end of the day, he is also commenting on the genocide on the white Africans. And these are actually mainly during recent instances from the South Africa, right? So this is how we have to understand this. Mr. Trump is actually behaving in a very erratic way recently. Next, Canada's Trump-proofing strategy is also something that we have to keep in mind, because Canada is not exactly at terms with the US president right now, and that is why they want to proof it or make it safe. I mean, the G7 meeting safe from Mr. Trump's antics. And this is why Mr. Carney, who is the Canadian Prime Minister, his game plan is that there should not be no joint communique, because if there is a particular joint statement from the G7 countries, the US can veto it. So that is why we have just also learned regarding the working of the G7 that right now we do not have a joint statement. We have some sectoral statements. So this is actually will be making the US veto on this particular thing very difficult. Next, when we talk about the Middle East crisis, we cannot skip the Israel and the Iran issue which is going on right now. As of now, they have also killed the CDS of the Iran forces. I mean, the Israel has actually attacked a lot of strategic forces in the Iran region. And obviously, the Prime Minister of Israel has recently also made a statement that till they are not killing the head of the state of Iran, they will not be stopping this kind of issues. And that is why Mr. Trump has also focused on deal making and left the summit in the middle. And obviously, when we talk about the European countries, the Germany, the EU, they want stricter Iran nuclear restrictions, but we are nowhere near any restrictions pertaining to Iran's nuclear capabilities. Next, when we talk about Russia-Ukraine war, this war is also not going anywhere. According to the Ukraine leader Zelensky, he is also present at the summit. He's been invited, and he will be obviously rallying for the backing of the G7 countries. Trump, on the other hand, thinks that Ukraine is being very disrespectful. He has something with the Russian president, Mr. Putin, and the US thinks, Mr. Trump thinks that US can end this crisis, in fact maybe prolonging even more. Next, also when we talk about Europe and the NATO, they are pushing for more weapons for the support of Ukraine. So we are seeing a kind of a discord or disharmony in the collective imagination of the G7. And at the end of the day, we have to keep our interests in mind, India. Where does India stand in everything? We have to obviously understand this. But firstly, we have to talk about Canada first, because after the Niger crisis of 2023, maybe this 2025 summit is a kind of a reset opportunity for India to engage with Canada and obviously try to improve the ties, because we have a lot of diaspora in Canada. But at the end of the day, also India's participation in the recent G7 summit in Canada has raised some issues in the domestic political circuits of Canada too, due to obvious reasons you can mention in the comments. Now, at the end of the day, we have to find some middle ground, and we have to firstly look at some of the more challenges that the G7 is facing right now, and these are the generic challenges, and then we have to discuss the way forward. And the way forward will be from India's strategic approach. Firstly, when I talk about the challenges, which are the other challenges apart from the ones we have discussed just now, we have no representation from global South powers. Global South countries will be dominating the entire world by 2050s, 60s, and that is why we have to have representation from India, Brazil, South Africa, China, and so on in the G7 increasingly. Also, because we have to understand the main reason is that the G7 countries and the GDP contribution is declining. It was at 50% in 1970s, right now it is under 30s. Also, when we talk about the internal divisions, we have just seen how we have so many internal conflicts between the G7 countries themselves. Also, between those countries, they have disagreements with climate change, China, and obviously war responses that we have just discussed. Also, they're extremely slow to respond. For example, in 2020-21, this COVID vaccination phase was being developed by the Western countries. They were extremely slow in disbursing them to the developing countries. That is one of them. And mainly because we have to understand these are advanced economies, home to advanced and profitable pharmaceutical companies. Because of the tech companies, they primarily focus on profits rather than welfare. It has been alleged in various policy circles. And at the end of the day, we have also some rise of alternatives right now, such as the BRICS, such as the SCO, such as the G20. And these are having a severe kind of competition with the G7 too. Now, when we talk about the way forward, we have to firstly understand India's role should be empathy for emerging economies, not engagement with the elites. We have to be the Vishwaguru of the global South. If India tries to do the same, India will be having better regional clout and international clout in the future. Second, we have to champion the multilateral reforms. By participating within the G7, we have to actually talk about inclusion of India in the UNSC, making proper reforms of the WTO, also the WHO and the international funding, where China is actually trying to have increased funding in all of these organizations. Next, we also have to leverage the G7 for technology, climate change and investment. For example, we have already some of the efforts by the G7 in the name of the Build Back Better World, and obviously regarding the PGII, which is actually a kind of an infrastructure initiative between the countries. Obviously, when we talk about infrastructure, we can actually try to expand this to the Indo-Pacific synergy that the G7 countries need to have with the Indian nation. And obviously India must be trying to fulfill the role of a bridge builder role between the G7 and the global south, which feels extremely alienated, mainly the small island developing nations and the various least developing countries of the African continent from the G7 countries. And at the end of the day, India must be also be maintaining strategic autonomy. Even in this Israel and Iran war, India showed strategic autonomy. You can mention how in the comments. Also, we have discussed this previously in the Analyst. Next, India is also still maintaining the Russia-Ukraine strategic autonomy. And obviously, we have so many instances where India should be not deviating from their national interests. And at the end of the day, G7 summits and any other international summits, particularly this one, is an excellent opportunity for India to spread our own narratives. Narratives regarding global debt relief, vaccine equity, climate justice, about spreading our digital public infrastructure such as a UPI and various other technological aspirations. This is an excellent opportunity. So that is how it brings me to the end of this topic with this mains practice question. You practice this, and based on this discussion, you can do the same. You can also include these facts and figures as a part of your introductions or even your conclusions. So now we'll be moving on to the next one. In the Hindu today, we have a very interesting editorial which is focusing on the importance of friendly relations between India and Bangladesh, because of late we have, due to many obvious reasons, we have seen how these two countries are slowly drifting apart, and this is a very tragic thing which is happening because the neighborhood needs to be united, because it has so many nefarious forces such as Pakistan and China, which are not at all friendly for not only this region but also for the entire world. So that is why we need to have a better trade strategy according to this editorial in the Bay of Bengal, because otherwise this will be risking the cooperative regionalism that must be present between all of the neighboring countries. This is extremely important for the GS2 subject again, because we have India and her neighborhood relations and obviously various international institutions where we are going to briefly talk about the BIMSTEC too. Now guys, firstly, let us understand what is the recent issue. I know that all of you must be aware of that, but for our new audience, let me just briefly give you the background of it. Now you know that the Sheikh Hasina government in Bangladesh was toppled by the various anti-national forces in Bangladesh according to Bangladeshi political circles and media. Now, once Hasina was ousted, the government, the interim government, is now led by the Nobel Prize winning economist Mr. Yunus. Now Mr. Yunus has been, after assuming office, been very aggressive against India for maybe obvious reasons or maybe for his own personal reasons. Now what happened, he was actually on a trip to China where he made some statements which totally went against India's interest, and most importantly went against India and Bangladesh bonhomie, because the chief advisor of Bangladesh, Mr. Yunus, actually told that the Northeast India is a landlocked region of India, and this is true. And what we have to understand, that he went further to tell that Bangladesh is the only guardian of the ocean for the Northeast India, and that is where he totally went wrong. While obviously the Northeast India is a landlocked region for India because it is having a very small access via the Chicken-Siliguri Neck corridor, which is connecting it to the mainland India. But it never means that it is isolated, because we have so many partners and we have actually so many agreements with the Southeast Asian regions also, which can actually transform Northeast India. And here, by this statement, he is trying to imply that he is actually the guardian angel of our Northeast India, which is such a ridiculous statement, and that is why Indian government took the tight action. Indian government ended the transshipment facility because we have to understand that Bangladesh is actually the leader. You can tell that is one of the global leaders when it comes to the garment exports industry. So what they do, they actually take access of our ports along Kolkata, Orissa and such regions, and it uses our ports to export their garments. So after such an irresponsible statement, it is only fit that the Indian government barred this transshipment facility. But here there are so many experts, including the editorial, who is telling that obviously this is a political statement which was made by the Bangladesh chief advisor. So we should not be taking this statement to trade and economic relations, because we have to understand that while we are actually trying to limit Bangladeshi exports from Indian ports, because Indian government gave the official reason that the Indian ports are congested, but we all know the real reason why this was actually taken place, and maybe at the very inside of us we know that this is the right thing to do, but at the end of the day maybe this kind of things also send some wrong messages to the entire neighborhood, which I am going to discuss later. Now coming back, in May 2025 also, in recently, India also blocked 7 Bangladeshi goods, which were right now forced to being exported via other ports, increasing 30% of their own costs. So after this statement, Bangladesh should have calmed down. No, they did not. Bangladesh counter moves were becoming more closer to China, attracting Chinese investments and obviously becoming close to their once enemy, that is Pakistan. I do not ever understand how this entire thing is in the collective Bangladeshi government imagination, that you are becoming friends with these countries which have nothing to do with your development but only to extract everything out of you. Whatever development you have done, they are only going to impede that. And that is why we have to right now also talk about the second aspect, which is the BIMSTEC. Now BIMSTEC stands for, you all must have known by now, the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical Economic Cooperation. We have the countries of India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Thailand, right? And here we have to understand that Bay of Bengal is actually a $3 trillion GDP zone. So all of these countries, if you calculate all the GDP and add them, it comes to $3 trillion. Obviously, India is actually the substantial chunk of this 3 trillion, economy. And here we also have 1.5 billion people, more than 1.5 billion people living in this entire region. So the main objective of BIMSTEC, when it was formed in 6 June 1997, was actually to have the economic growth and technical cooperation in the entire region, mainly via better infrastructural facilities. Correct? Now, BIMSTEC has the headquarters at Dhaka, and we have to understand that when we talk about the importance or say the main sectors of cooperation, we have trade, investment, transport, communication, tourism, technology, fisheries and so many other things which are the collective interest of all of these countries. Now we have to understand that recently India has taken so many initiatives to reinvigorate the BIMSTEC, mainly via the Maritime Transport Cooperation Agreement. And this particular agreement will be building better roads, infrastructure facilities, mainly the coastal areas and the various say multimodal linkages of transporting goods and services via ships, then via roadways, then also connecting the roadways to the railways in these particular nations. And mainly we have to understand Bhutan, Myanmar and Nepal mainly have everything to gain from such initiatives. Apart from this, even Bangladesh has a lot of to gain. Now guys, after this, please solve this 25 question, prelims 25 question that came regarding the BIMSTEC. A little hint is also given for your reference here. Let me know the answer in the comments. Now, we have to understand Bangladesh is having this issue with us, right? On the other hand, India is also right now focusing a lot on regional cooperation by the BIMSTEC. So don't you think that these two things are clashing together, because Bangladesh is actually a very integral part of the BIMSTEC. Apart from sharing the land boundary and the maritime boundary with India, Bangladesh is actually also one of the biggest markets in the entire region for Indian exports and vice versa too. So that means these issues matter beyond bilateral ties right now. It goes beyond the bilateral ties to the neighborhood relations and also to China. Let us discuss what are the impact and significance of such actions by India to block Bangladesh transshipment goods to be exported from India, or what is the recent relevance of the BIMSTEC amidst the background of India and Bangladesh relations? Firstly, we have to understand that when India is trying to block Bangladesh exports via Indian ports, this is maybe sending a message that India is an unreliable partner if trade terms shift with politics. I told this earlier also, that according to this editorial, he's telling that this particular a decision by the Indian government may send a negative message across the regions, because countries such as Nepal, Bhutan and so many other regions are also dependent on India. So maybe they can also think that in the future, maybe due to some political reasons, maybe India can bottleneck our exports. This is maybe the wrong message which can be sent to the neighboring countries. Because whatever political issues we have, can we not sit and talk? Apart from this kind of irresponsible statements, can we not wait for some opportune event to take some other actions apart from these trade relations? Because trade and logistics and the impact that it had not only led to Bangladesh's loss, it has also led to our loss also. Because if we are leasing our ports to Bangladeshis, we are charging some fees and various aspects. That is why we are also losing some money here. Next, Myanmar and Thailand and Sri Lanka, who are also port economies and who are also reliant on Indian ports too for some of their exports, they may also think that if India does this to Bangladesh, will we be the next ones? Next, we have to understand that after this particular incident that we had with Bangladesh, China swiftly came in with more investments, with more opportunities and obviously with more loans to grab Bangladeshis investments and everything. That is why we are right now maybe seeing a string of Pulse 2.0, where earlier where China was not present as a part of the string of Pulse 1.0. Right now, China is actually trying to be more friendly with the previously friendly countries with India. And that is where, this can be a very dangerous thing. And at the end of the day, BIMSTEC vision of a neutral shared trade infrastructure is threatened. Because we have to understand, for Nepal and Bhutan, BIMSTEC is actually a gateway to India to access the seas for their exports. Myanmar and Thailand, they want to reduce their reliance on China. Obviously, Sri Lanka wants to improve its transshipment port system in their country. And that is why they need technical cooperation from India too. And obviously, India will be gaining the entire thing because BIMSTEC is also a kind of a light edition of the Act East policy too. So that is where we have to keep all these things in mind, and now we have to discuss the potential outcomes that India must be focusing on by adopting a credible way forward. The author firstly says that we can depolitize the port access. Let's not bring politics into economics. That is what the main message is here. That we must be focusing on economics. We can actually do politics in our backyard. Next is that let us have a free trade agreement between the BIMSTEC countries so that we can be more economically dependent on each other, and we will not be having this kind of political issues, because since economics, money, trade is actually an unifying force. Next, we have to counter China with better deals and not bans. Better deals must be struck with these particular nations under BIMSTEC, under various unilateral, bilateral mechanisms, and the bans must be restricted to the minimum. And that is where we have to focus on building effective communication channels. When we talk about the same issue that we are having with Bangladesh, we must be having proper communication channels. And at the end of the day, we have to also offer a roadmap for normalization of the ties after the disruption in the ties in recent times. Because we have to keep in mind India's strengths, that we have the strengths of better ports. We have also a particular initiative known as the Sagarmala project, which is a $1-3 billion worth of port upgrades. Also, we have the BIMSTEC maritime deal which was recently struck. So that is why let us leverage this, because at the end of the day, if we do not do the same, we have the risks of losing Bangladesh, losing Sri Lanka to Chinese ambitions as they are doing right now. At the end of the day, maybe the neighbors also will not be friendly to us and be more close to China. And the image of India will be transformed from a Vishwaguru to an unreliable partner according to the author. So this is where we have to take actions to curtail all these things, which is why practice this question to actually show your thoughts in your words. So now let us move on to the simplified articles. Guys, last month the government of India actually decided that we will be having the periodic labor force survey every month, and this is actually the first survey which has came onto with interesting data that we have to keep in mind for our mains examination and also for our prelims examination, because the trends of employment are actually extremely crucial questions in this both examinations. Now, when we talk about the background of this PLFS, let me just revise what were the changes that the government decided to do from January this year. So firstly, they thought of releasing the employment surveys every single month, and they will be focusing on the labor force participation rate, worker participation rate, and obviously about the unemployment level at an all India level, and they will be mainly be basing their surveys on a particular economic method of surveying which is known as the current weekly status. Now let us actually look at some labor market terms before moving on. Now when we talk about the labor force participation rate, this is actually, please remember, this can be extremely crucial for your prelims examination. Labor force participation rate means percentage of the population working right now or actively seeking work. When we talk about the same with reference to worker population ratio, this is actually the percentage of employed persons in total population. Correct? So this is where the differences are very important. Now when we talk about the unemployment rate, obviously we mean this is the total percentage of unemployed persons in the labor force, right? So this is actually a part of the labor force participation rate. And obviously when we talk about the current weekly status, employment status in the last 7 days will be asked to the various people. For example, say the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation will be going to the various primary units, for example, so the districts. So maybe the officers are going to the districts and they are asking that if you were able to work for even 1 hour in the last 7 days. So if that particular person is telling that yes, I have worked for at least 1 hour or 2 hours, that means that person is employed. If you are not employed for even 1 hour for the last 7 days, you are termed as unemployed. Correct? Now, apart from this, there are other approaches of measuring unemployment too. That is the usual status that actually looks into the status over the past 365 days. Now this usual status is also divided into two types, such as the usual principal status. That means for the majority, that means half of the year, right, you have to be employed. Correct? And that means if you are for the half of the year, if you are employed, that means you are termed as an employed person, otherwise you are an unemployed individual. Also, we have the usual principal status and subsidiary status, UPSS, which is actually looking at on also your UPS, that is the usual principal status, that is the majority of the work that you have done in the year, and also according to the secondary economic activity that you're doing, because there are some people who apart from doing their primary job, they also have some second job also, mainly in the rural areas too. So that is why this statisticians, they also ask the people that whether you have had any subsidiary work apart from your primary job, and if you are having this job for 30 days also, that means you are employed. Correct? Otherwise you are unemployed. So this is why you should be keeping these indicators in mind also, because in 2023 UPSC has asked you how India calculates its unemployment rate via surveys. Now coming back again to the background of these changes. So when we talk about the quarterly estimates, this has been been earlier urban only. Right now we have both rural and urban labor data. Obviously when we talk about the reports, now the format has been changed to January to December. Earlier it was July to June, right? The next year, right? Because we have to be compatible with the WTO standards, the United Nations standards for international organizations, and because they also sometimes calculate our unemployment rate too. And obviously when we talk about the study size and scope, that has been increased by 2.65 times, and this has been done at the district level. Now when we talk about the data, this source is generally the PLFS survey which was released last day itself. So let us look at some of the key insights. When we talk about the unemployment snapshot or the highlights, we actually see that the overall unemployment rate has increased from April 25 to May 25. Correct? And obviously when we talk about the female unemployment rate, male unemployment rate, the youth unemployment rate, the urban unemployment and the rural unemployment rate between youth, they all have increased. That means unemployment in India has increased marginally. When we also talk about the regional differences between rural and urban individuals, we find less unemployment in the rural sector, right? Because mainly the rural areas have some economic activities that the unemployed laborers will be easily be absorbed, maybe in the agricultural laborer, right? And obviously when we talk about this increase in the rural unemployment, but it has increased from April. The same has been the case of urban areas where the unemployment rate has increased, mainly because we have to keep in mind that after this rural sector, right, which has been seen unemployment, mainly it has been the post-harvest kind of slump period which has been in the months between April and May. That is why we are seeing kind of unemployment, right? And obviously when we talk about the urban, we are seeing less casual labor as of now. Next, when we try to analyze the sectoral shift, employment has been kind of shifting from agriculture to secondary services, or the tertiary sector and the secondary sector. And here we have to understand that mainly because of the fall in the farm jobs, we are seeing this transition. Now when we talk about the labor force participation rate, right, everything has gone down. When we talk about the total labor force participation rate, the rural, the urban, the male, female, and so on. So we have to understand that this thing has gone down. And here we have mainly the women to attribute, because the casual and the unpaid rural women workers have exited the workforce. Because when we talk about the rural and urban female workers, both the labor force has gone down here. And women being a significant chunk of the population in India, if their numbers go down, the labor force participation obviously will be going down. Correct? And obviously when we talk about the reason, because mainly the women in the rural areas prominently were employed as casual and unpaid labor. So you cannot term that as a kind of a structural employment or a formal employment. Next, when we also have discussed previously that the Ravi harvest and the summer heat is actually one of the reasons why also the agricultural sector has seen increasing unemployment. Next, we also have the domestic responsibilities which have actually pulled the women back. So these are the main reasons which I have to keep in mind for the decline in the labor force participation rate. Now, 2018 and 2013 PYQs are in front of you. You tell me the answers in the comments below. Guys, in this next one, we have a very important report from the World Bank on the foreign direct investments across the entire world. And this is extremely important for the Indian economy sections of the GS3. And obviously, when we talk about prelims, sometimes they also ask regarding the trends in the FDI. Now, you know that foreign direct investments are actually the long-term investments that mainly emanate from the developed economies such as the US and their own subsidiaries. Sometimes they also come from Hong Kong and Singapore into India. So these are mainly the long-term investment that the investors have in India with reference to maybe manufacturing industries or with reference to various other sectors such as insurance, defense, and so on. Now, this report is very concerning for everyone, not only for India, because this is a red flag for global development, because you have to keep in mind that FDI is actually the leverage that developing countries use for creating employment, for having technology transfers from the developed countries. And if the FDIs are reducing, the employment opportunities, the technological transfer, they also reduce over a period of time. As you can see here in this particular map, this chart here, from 2005 to 2023, historically, the FDI is on a declining trend despite some increases in the between, but on a steep decline we are seeing right now, especially in the 2023 financial year, right? Mainly the emerging and middle developing economies, right? We have had steep declines. We have had only $435 billion. And when we talk about the FDI to the advanced economies, they are at $366 billion. Now, when we talk about India's share from 2012 to 23, it is only 6% of the total FDI inflows into the emerging middle income countries, correct? And obviously when we talk about the previous FDI into the EMDEs or the emerging developing economies, that was actually higher than the current figure right now. As you can look at here, this is actually higher almost by $150 billion, correct? And this is actually the lowest since 2005, since we are starting this chart. So the FDI levels are back at 2005 levels for emerging countries and 1996 for advanced economies. So this is actually a concern. Now, the main thing here for the examination, obviously the numbers are important, but from an UPSC perspective, aspirants need to be very aware of exactly why such declines or increases happen in economics. Firstly, when we talk about the reasons of decline of FDI, let us first appreciate the main reason here, that is deglobalization, which took place after COVID pandemic 2021-22, when the global supply chain was in a shock and the rest of the countries thought of becoming Atmanirbhar, self-reliant, and that is why they started closing borders. They stopped trading too much in dollars. Even we did. We tried to have internationalization of our Indian rupee. Russia did trade with us in rupees and rubles. That is why we are right now seeing high instances of protectionism in trade. Reshoring, companies are trying to shift their bases maybe from China back to the various other developing countries, even India. And obviously we have so many geopolitical rivalries, due to which the investors are not too much interested to invest more money. Next, we also have right now too much of investment screening and regulatory barriers. For example, via security, technology and data concerns, some of the countries, maybe mainly the Western countries, are trying to curtail the FDI inflows, citing these issues. Obviously, at the end of the day, we have so much public debt that the governments of the developing countries are facing. We are not talking about India here because India's debt is kind of sustainable. But when we talk about other countries such as Brazil, such as Indonesia, right, and various other developing economies, their debt or fiscal deficit is quite high. And you know, if any country's fiscal deficit or debt is too high, the investors are not too much ready to invest in those countries because they think that the government tomorrow is going to repay their own debt, rather than building more schools or hospitals or roads or airports and such infrastructure. Next, we also have to understand that right now we have global uncertainty because of so many reasons. We have had inflation in the past after COVID. After that, we had Russia-Ukraine crisis. After that, we had Israel-Gaza crisis. Right now, Iran-Israel crisis. We have had Armenia and so many other international conflicts over a period of time, which reduce investor appetite. They do not feel hungry to invest anymore. And at the end of the day, we have also a fragmented multilateralism, the UN, the WTO, the various other mechanisms are not functionally fine right now. Obviously, that is why we need to now adopt some great strategies. Look at Vietnam. Vietnam, since it saw that the companies are shifting away from China, right, be it the electronic companies, be it semiconductor companies, they have tried to attract investments, mainly in the processing and manufacturing sector, as we can see. In the next slide, I will be showing you where India is trying to have more investments, but we can learn from Vietnam, who is trying to have more investments from processing and manufacturing, right, followed by electricity distribution and so on. So we have to understand that we have to now diversify our FDI sources. Now guys, here I have the data for India here, which I got from this PIB website. This website will be, the link for this will be given in your handouts. All of you are requested to please go through this article because it is capturing the entire snapshot of economic sector of India, be it from exports, FDI, agricultural industry and so on. Extremely important for your examination. From this only I have tried to extract some information that the scene, while it is very gloomy and sad internationally, it is quite normal in India. Obviously, we have seen declines in FDI investments because obviously FDI is an international phenomena. If the investors internationally not happy, they will not be investing. So that is why the cumulative FDI in India is actually amounting at $1.05 trillion, which has seen a 20-fold growth from 2000, that is from last 24 years. Obviously, when we talk about the last year, we have a growth rate of almost 27%, which is a friendly kind of a growth rate. Also, when we talk about the highest annual growth rate of FDI, that was in 2021-22, when we touched $84 billion, right? And obviously, when we talk about the last 10 years trend of FDI, this is actually 67% of the total of the FDI that we got since 2000. It is also very welcoming and friendly for India to have more automatic routes where the companies can directly set up with least kind of government regulations and licenses. So 90% of the FDI right now comes via automatic route rather than the government approval route. And here when we talk about the top sectors, try to have the difference with the Vietnam sectors. Firstly, we have the services, financial consultancy services. Then we have computer and hardware, right? Then we have trading, telecom and automobiles. And services plus technology is contributing over 30% of FDI, which means that we have a knowledge economy edge in the entire world. But gradually we need to also learn from Vietnam by having more ease of doing business, by having better amount of free trade agreement with the Western countries in the technological aspects, and also effective labor policies. So this brings me to another set of PYQs of 2021-20. So let me know the answers in the comments. Now to the next one. Guys, the latest Bonn climate conference is going to be held at Germany, and this is where we need to be updated with what's at stake. Now for GS2 and for prelims, we need to be very well aware of the environmental aspects, mainly the international organizations that pertain to here, because there are so many questions in the past regarding climate conferences, climate organizations, climate funds and various other things. That is why the Bonn Climate Change Convention is actually very important because of the various issues that is going to take place. Now every year, every summer, the countries all around the world who are actually part of this Bonn Convention actually gather at Bonn in Germany for the climate talks. And actually when we talk about, these are not important like the COP or under the UNFCCC, which is actually the main climate conference which mainly take by the end of the year. These are actually thought of this mid-year climate change talks, where the official name of the same is UNFCCC subsidiary bodies sessions. So here the subsidiaries bodies are there who are the main implementation agencies. We also have the scientific bodies who actually are consisted of experts in climate change. Then we have the various indigenous leaders across the entire world, and obviously the climate activists who are present at this particular conference. Now guys, the Bonn Climate Change Conference is actually functioning under the aegis of the UNFCCC, correct? And when we talk about the mission, they actually try to prepare the COP agenda that is going to take place by the end of the year, every year, right? They are trying to debate various climate deals. They also will be checking the progress on what countries are doing, how much related to climate change, and obviously they will be also be demanding cash or the money that is needed by the developing countries to transition to a green future, right? Now, the biggest goal of 2025 will be these topics here. Firstly, guys, let me just clarify this thing in the very beginning. The main difference between mitigation and adaptation in climate change terms. Pay attention. Mitigation means that you are having better electric vehicles, you are trying to have more solar energy, you are trying to have better energy efficiency by green buildings and so on. Why? Because you want to reduce the greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming, that contribute to climate change. These are the things that you have to do when you have to mitigate the greenhouse gases, reduce the greenhouse gases, and hence reduce the climate change. Now, totally opposite is the adaptation here. Adaptation is related, but we have to understand these are long-term things. That means you are having flood protection for the islands who are will be potentially sinking in the future. You are having disaster management and business continuity. You are having various infrastructural upgrades which are very costly. Sometimes it needs great amount of technology. Here your main thing is to reduce the risk of climate change impacts. That means under adaptation, you agree that climate change is there and we have to reduce the impact. That means you are not focused on greenhouse gases, right? The greenhouse gases is actually the main subject matter of the climate mitigation, which the majority of the developing economies, they try to advocate for. Because the developing countries know that going forward, if we do not mitigate right now, the costs are only going to increase in the future. So that is why, the main aspect here is to have more funds for climate mitigation and climate finance. And here, the $1 trillion question is who will be funding this $400 billion per year that is needed by entire nations by 2030 to have mitigation and adaptation both. So here we have to understand that the countries are still short by 80% of climate finance, because simply the Western countries, the US say that we cannot pay alone. The EU, they say that I am not going to pay. India also should also pay. China should also pay. The Gulf countries should also pay, because they are also the top polluters, but they forget the historical responsibilities. In the comments, you tell me whether you agree with this or not. Next, Also, when we talk about the cuts in the aid, right? Italy, UK, they have cut their own budget in their own countries, let alone the climate finance globally. Obviously, at the end of the day, we get so many scam calls daily, right? Here also a scam is going on because rich nations try to label all loans that they have given to the developing countries as climate finance. Such a big hypocrisy. And that is why they are also trying to subvert the agenda by, transforming the climate mitigation talks, and they are more advocating the adaptation talks, because it is very easy for them to spend money and have adaptation, but not the technology or say the time for climate mitigation. So that is why we have to understand the global goal on adaptation was adopted at the climate agreement of Paris in 2015, and the COP28 in 2023 agreed on this framework, and maybe the Bonn summit is going to discuss on the same. So mainly the fight ahead may be seen between the rich and the poor countries. Eventually, at the end of the day, in my own personal opinion, I think that the rich countries will be prevailing because they try to veto every kind of aspect related to climate change. And at the end of the day, we have to also see the role of the EU and the US. Very little hopes here because of Mr. Trump, who is having some issues with the climate change talks. Now let us see what will be going on. Now moving on to the next one. In this article, we are going to understand the main structure of the Financial Action Task Force, and obviously how it has for the very first time, condemned the Pahalgam attack. Now, firstly, the FATF is actually a very important institution for combating money laundering and terrorism financing, various other mechanisms too. Firstly, it is an intergovernmental organization mainly formed under the aegis of the OECD. You mentioned me the members of the OECD in the comments below. That is mainly, visualized to combat money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation of nuclear weapons and the financing, right? Mainly the financial aspects, crypto, shell companies, hawala networks, arms deals and various other aspects related to money laundering and terrorist financing and various international security concerns. It was established in 1989, and here mainly at the G7 summit, mainly at Paris, it has the headquarters of the same. It was mainly, when it was established, was dealing with arms smuggling, financing and so many other aspects of drug smuggling. But over a period of time, it has evolved mainly after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the US to also looking into terrorism financing. The members here are 39 countries, where India is one of them, plus 180 linked countries via regional bodies. Mainly, countries who join have big economies or better economies, good functioning economies with proper standards. They also have clean financial laws, and at the end of the day, they are active in various global organizations. The main thing here regarding FATF is their list. So they have the grey list, which generally mean the country which are included in the grey list, they are having dirty money risk zones. They are very risky countries, and generally the consequence is that if a country is enlisted in the grey list, the investors run away from the countries. They have higher borrowing cost and they have extra surveillance by the FATF. So mainly Pakistan was there till 2022-23, and as of now there are around 24 countries here. And the main serious list here is a blacklist. Once you are a blacklist, you are labeled as a terror funding hub, and no IMF, World Bank loans you will be getting. You will not be part of the global trade loans, and neither the banks will be extending you any deals. So that is where we have to understand that we have Korea, Iran and Myanmar, right? And maybe Pakistan is very willing to include themselves in this list in the future, because FATF is very strict on this matter. It has issued a statement condemning the Pahalgam attack by not naming Pakistan, but obviously it is evident, right? Because under the recommendation 38 R.38 of the FATF, there must be swift cross-border cooperation to identify, free, seize any terrorism activities or terrorist camps. So if Pakistan is compliant with FATF, it must have conducted some operation with India to eliminate this, but it is still non-compliant. And obviously it is kind of partially compliant since 2022, right? Even when it comes to mutual legal assistance between the two countries, Pakistan is not cooperative, and that is why, despite removing from the grey list, FATF is always keeping Pakistan in their follow-up list. Correct? And now we have to understand, mainly the focus is on cryptocurrencies, Hawala networks, charities, NGOs, and various cross-border cash smuggling, which the Pahalgam, attack terrorists use. And that is why right now this kind of financial DNA of terrorism is under the scanner. And FATF will soon release a report next month for the first time, which will be including state sponsorship as a separate source of funding of terror, apart from the things that we have discussed right now. So now we'll be moving on to the last one. Our Home Minister, guys, have introduced 3 important platforms for better disaster management, extremely crucial for a prelims and main section of our disaster and disaster management. So here, when we talk about the key tech platforms that have been launched, firstly, it is the ICR-ER Integrated Control Room for Emergency Response, which gives real-time disaster response via satellite streaming to rescue agencies for better rescue operations. Next, we have NDEM Lite 2.0, where it is standing for National Database for Emergency Management, which is actually a mobile accessible, very app-friendly database of disasters, which can improve the coordination of disaster agencies across India. And at the end of the day, for a state specific mechanism has been taken place. The flood hazard zonation atlas of Assam has been done, where satellite mapping of risk prone regions related to flood has been done and can have better infrastructural abilities and functions for the agricultural sector in the state of Assam. So these are the main platforms we have to keep in mind. And finally, at the end of the day, thank you all for being a very patient audience. Please attempt the quiz which is following up. We'll be meeting again. Till then, all the best and best of luck. Thank you.